I'll try not to wave my arms too much, sir, because it seems the parliamentary secretary believes that my arm waving annoys you, so I would never try to annoy the speaker. But being a Scotsman, part of the problem is we are somewhat inclined to move our arms. But at least when we're moving our arms, it's talking about a sense of having conviction and passion about doing something immediately and not flapping our arms in the air trying to fly like a gull when clearly we're not. But ultimately, this really is about an emergency, an emergent issue that's now, not in 3 or 5 years. There's no question that additional data will be a good thing, and the round table will eventually, Mr. Speaker, be helpful. But the round table that will come up with recommendations in 6 months from now, the initial report, and then additional reports over the next 5 years, will not move one more bushel of grain off the prairies in the next foreseeable future. And yes, there's recommendations not only from the minister, but from Farm Credit Canada that farmers should apply for advance payments. And that certainly is a program there to protect farmers. But in some cases, these farmers are going to actually have advance payments and may still have crops in their bin in April when they're getting ready to seed the next new crop, and actually have to repay it by September, and may not actually have the funds to do that. So will the minister, I guess, to you, Mr. Speaker, I guess to the minister, would his position then be a sense of forgiveness for some of those things if they don't happen? Because clearly if you're backstopping that, then they still run into difficulties. It's going to be farmers who take on additional debt loads for what wasn't their problem. They didn't cause the fact that this logistics problem can't get grain out of their farms to ports and get it to their customers. In fact, it was this government that said, and I remember it all so well, and I know a couple of my colleagues down the way at the end who were at that committee hearing, the member from Malpeque and Wascana, when it was the minister that said, well, you just need to get with the times and forward contract. Well, I got an email from a farmer who forward contracted, Mr. Speaker, in November. And he said to me, I haven't moved a bushel yet, and it's now February. So much for the whole article. Well, just forward contracted. When he forward contracted, he had a price of $7. He's now looking at a base price of $4. And no one's telling him who's making up the 3. He asked the elevator, are they making it up? They said, well, we don't know. We don't know what we're going to sell it for. We don't care what the contract was. There's another account of a farmer who had 20,000 or 85,000 tons actually of malt. Lo and behold, the buyout contract inside it, because it never moved, not one bushel moved. The buyout ended up being $1 a ton. So what do? They bought out his contract instead of honoring it. So instead of him being able to sell it for $4.50, he ended up getting $1. And so at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, it is farmers who are suffering. And clearly we need to do this. Now, to my friend across the way, the parliamentary secretary, a tentative agreement means exactly that. It means that both sides have said, we think we actually got a good deal. They'll take it back to their membership on the union side, the Teamsters will, and put it before their membership and ask them to ratify it. What I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, is folks on the other side have a little faith in the process. Rather than jumping the gun, the tentative agreement's been reached. 99% of the time, tentative agreements are actually ratified because they're empowered. The members that actually bargain on behalf of those folks who are workers are empowered by those workers to go and do that job for them, usually with marching orders as to what they need to bargain, because that's why they go there. And so it seemed to me it looks as if, according to the parliamentary secretary in his announcement, there's a tentative agreement, that's a good news story. And we should accept it as a good news story and not look to continue to swing at workers when there's not necessarily something to swing at. But I think, Mr. Speaker, what we need to actually do is look at some of the things that have happened in the last year, and specifically at CP. There's an interesting note. There was an article in the Globe and Mail business section last week featuring the new CEO of CP. And so what was Harrison's Revolution is the title of the article and the chart that they laid. And what was that? 90,000 carloads of crude oil CP moved in 2013, 68% increase over 2012. It's a good news story for CP. Not grain, mind you, but it's a good news story for them. 4,550 jobs eliminated. That's not a good news story for those workers, their families, and their communities, and not good for farmers, Mr. Speaker, because these were folks that actually drove locomotives. 11,000 rail cars removed from service. Now, were they decrepit, Mr. Speaker? Were they broken down, no longer functioning? Nope. Took them out of service. And then what did we do? We took out 400 locomotives. My colleague from Wascana talked about we need to put more locomotive power on the track. What did CP do? Took it out. Removed it. And yet everybody knew we were headed for a bumper crop, and at the time we were headed for a bumper crop, this railroad took capacity out to maximize its profit. And so what did it get? It got a better operating ratio and had more profit, and its shares went up. Well done, CP. They made a business decision based on them, not the overall system. We know we need to get grain off the prairies, and the primary mode of transportation is rail. And we have two railways in this country, CN, CP, and we have short lines who do great work. But primarily we're looking at two. They have basically a duopoly in this country. So I take my friends in the Liberal Party back to 2001, when there was actually a review done in the rail. It was their government at the time. The esteemed Justice Este was actually part of that, who talked about, should we have open access? That was part of it. Senator Banks was also part of that review. And the recommendation Justice Este decided was he thought open access should be part of the changes in making competition more on the rail between CN, CP, allowing other players in. Short line railroads at the time were very keen on it. Short line railroads today are very keen on it, by the way, Mr. Speaker. They still are, which would help with this emergency access, by the way. At the moment, short liners are willing to step up and help if CN and CP can't. The difficulty was the supporters were, the review panel was Justice Willard Este. He supported it. Senator Banks supported it. It was supported by the Canadian Wheat Board. It was supported by Grain Commission and Growers. It was supported by a number of other folks. And the two major players who said they didn't want it, actually three, CN, CP, and Transport Canada. Now, can't talk about CN and CP in the sense they're private businesses. I guess they make those kind of decisions. But Transport Canada is ours, belongs to the government. We deal with that. We have a Minister of Transport. We have authority there. And the irony of irony, in fact, it was actually hypocritical, Mr. Speaker. CN and CP, at the very time they said, we don't want open access on our lines in Canada, were lobbying the U.S. government to have open access into the United States on their rail lines. And so while they thought it was good for them in the U.S., they didn't want to do it in Canada. They wanted to close off that loop just to protect themselves and got access into the United States. So the irony of all of that, Mr. Speaker, is at a time, 12 years ago, when this review was done, we actually may have had more competition than we have now. Now, there's no guarantee of that, sir, Mr. Speaker. None. Because we don't know if indeed those competitors would come in and maybe perhaps they would have been taken over, perhaps they would have gone out of business. We're not necessarily certain. But what it points to is that indeed open access is an alternative to be looked at. The government is asking for ideas from this side of the House. I'm happy that they're asking. And so that would be one that we would suggest that they look at. It's not simple to do. Running a railroad is not an easy business. Allowing other access on your rail line requires logistical support and requires planning. For sure it does. So it has to be well thought out. But it ought to be thought about at this moment and this juncture in time. We could do it for a short period of time and see how it works out. Maybe it's a longer-term strategy. Maybe that comes out of the round table. But I have to be honest with you, Mr. Speaker. I have this visions of a round table. And I remember the railroad set that I got when I was a child many years ago growing up in Glasgow, Scotland. And they went round and around and never went anywhere. So this round table and this train that goes round and round and round, I have this vision, nothing will happen. Grain just won't move. We won't actually do what we want to do, which I think all of us want to do. I don't think anyone in this House is saying, well, let's not bother with it. The problem is there's solutions that need to be explored, and it can't be about let's worry about it in 5 years or 2 years. There are farmers who are hurting now. We all know that. We've all received emails from across the country, from the prairies, from farmers who say, look, I'm broke. I haven't moved anything. I don't get paid if I don't move it. I can't move it. I talked to a gentleman just the other night from the Port of Vancouver. And he said to me straight out, he said, we're half empty. He said, my bins in the port are half empty. He said, now I'm literally shuttling ships up and down the berth. He said, as I fill 1/3 here and move that one up, like I park cars, and then move another ship in and fill it 1/3, and then move it back and bring the other one back. He said, and I now got ships hanging out off Vancouver Island at anchor because I can't put them into Burrard Inlet anymore. There's not enough room. So the backlog is not at the port, clearly. The backlog is as we head inland. One of the ways to solve it is perhaps to look at open access. I think the government should look at it. The other thing when I was looking at this, Mr. Speaker, especially the railway piece, looking back in time as to what happened, one of the things I found was actually back in 2000, the two railroads got together, and they ended up doing what's called the Fraser Canyon deal between the two of them, where they run west up one line, both of them, through the Fraser Canyon. Fraser Canyon, for those who may not know, a bit of a bottleneck for the railroads, part of the geography of the country that we live in, and it's part of the fact that which actually amazes me. I've always wondered about this, Mr. Speaker, when companies say, well, you know, it's snowing. Yeah, it is. It's winter. It's Canada. And it snows in the mountains. And so one would think, as a major railroader, one would think about those issues. We understand it slows things down. But the Fraser Canyon piece was done because the railroads, two of them got together and said it'd be more efficient for themselves to do it that way. Up one side where the grade is lower going west, back the other side where the grade is higher. Because they're coming empty for the most part coming back, especially the hopper cars. So they did that. They actually created efficiencies for themselves and didn't pass any of the money back. Now, not unusual, but another idea for the government to suggest to the railroads. If it was good enough for them to do in 2000 and they actually were more efficient, at this moment in time where we actually need them to be more efficient, and we need more capacity on the prairies to move grain, another idea for the government to perhaps pursue with the railroads. Because talking to them clearly hasn't had any major effect on them. And so when we look at it, and I know there's lots of numbers being thrown around, let me just basically give you some other numbers, Mr. Speaker, because heaven knows they've been bandied about tonight. So here's what CN booked for the full year last year. For 2012, it booked 597,000 potash and grain cars. And in 2013, it booked and handled 572,000. It's down, not up. At a moment in time when there's a bumper record crop on the prairies, CN's carloads are down, not up. Now, I can't suggest that they took stuff out of service because they didn't do that, unlike CP that took their capacity away to increase their share profit. CN just didn't deliver the cars. And my colleagues have talked at numerous times about a large number of orders for cars when even the minister says he wants to know if I ordered 150 cars and an elevator orders 150 cars, they get 100. How come? Why doesn't he know? This has been going on for months. I would have expected the minister to actually be out there saying, I no longer want to ask the question, you're going to answer it. You're going to answer it now. And I don't want to hear any gum chin wagging stuff about it's winter. I want to know where this stuff is coming from, because clearly it's not happening. We all hear it. And we, as legislators, as the policymakers, we're the ones that actually have the stick when it comes to the railroad. Because clearly, the elevator companies don't. The grain farmers certainly don't. And the railroads, both of them, their profits are up last year, and they're singing a merry tune to their shareholders. So why would they do something different? Is it in their best interest to do something different? I would suggest they would think probably not. I've got a record year for my profit bottom line. The share price is up. My bonus is good. Why would I want to actually put capacity on the line that maybe I'm going to use for a couple of months, and I'm carrying the overhead for 6 months or a year? My bottom line shrinks. Why would I do that? They're not service providers from the goodness of their heart. They're service providers to make money. We should accept that. The government of all folks should know that. They set it up that way. So if we want them to provide a service, a true service to farmers that says, we are in an emergency situation, we need to move it. We need to move this grain off the prairies. Then it's going to take more than sitting down with the railroaders and saying, can you do me a favor? I would suggest the minister needs to sit down with the railroaders and dangle a carrot. And when they refuse it, hit them with a great big stick and saying, you're going to do it, or we're going to start talking about you own from the wheels up and we own the track. Because that's the way you're going to make them move. At the end of the day, if we own the track as a Canadian government, the railroaders will move. Because then we'll make decisions about open access, short line railroads helping out, because they can, because they've got the initiative to do that. So we can bandy about the politics of the wheat board, which, lots of us would like to go back to that, but one thing is clear. The logistics end of the wheat board worked. Now, it may not have worked as well as everyone would like it. But we threw it all out and had nothing to replace it by, and now we've got a 5-year study that Mr. Bacon says we need to put back in place. I don't reach for the exact quote, but we need to put back in place a thing that gets it from the farm to the elevator, to the railroad, to the port, to the terminal, and into our market. And if we don't do that, we're tarnishing our image, he says. That's already starting to tarnish. So when we become an irregular supplier, Mr. Speaker, when our customers see us as someone who cannot get product to them, what do? I'll bet you Australia's knocking on their door. I'll bet you the Americans are knocking on their door. I'll bet you Brazil is knocking on their door saying, those Canadians can't deliver it, we can. There's an emergency for a reason. There's an emergency debate for a reason, because it is indeed an emergency, which means action, not words. I'd act, but I'm not the government. I'd enact it now. But you won't let me, because you're the government. That's the rules of the House. So I look to the government. Where's the action plan? Heaven knows you've got enough of those billboards hanging about. Show us some action on this one. They're wonderful looking colors. Got lovely green on it. I spotted orange on it once. Well, maybe somebody painted it extra, Mr. Speaker. Maybe somebody put a dash of color on there. It's time for action from this government. The minister truly, and the Prime Minister, quite frankly, need to simply say, we got to actually act. We've got to move forward on it. Farmers depend upon it. And it's not just farmers. Let me end with this, Mr. Speaker. There's a number of things that are happening across the broader economy. There's a mill in BC that shut down because it can't move product either. There are millers who are saying, I haven't got product, I'm probably going to have to go idle for a while. The canola plant in the western provinces last week went idle for a couple of days, couldn't get rid of its crush. Where was the crush going? It was going to farmers who had cattle, who wanted to feed them. And none of that happened. None of that moved. Because as this bottleneck gets bigger, the backup impacts more than just the farmers. But clearly, the ones in the most need at this moment in time, because unlike others, they do not get paid if they can't deliver. And as I said at the beginning, Mr. Speaker, these are farmers who contracted to sell their grain months ago, and they still have it, through no fault of their own. They took the government's advice on the CWB when it left and said, okay, we'll do all of those things. I'm going to go forward, and I'll forward market, and I'll do all the great things the government said. You might have released market freedom. The problem is they're free to keep all their grain in their bins, and it's free to them because they can't get a nickel for it if they can't move it. The obligation, clearly, Mr. Speaker, I know these are my last words, is on the government to show initiative, to make a decision, and act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo.